Sarah Mitchell had been staring at the wedding invitation for 3 weeks before she finally decided to go. Her younger sister Emma was getting married at the Riverside Country Club just outside Portland, and despite everything that had happened between them over the past 2 years, Sarah couldn't bring herself to miss it. The invitation had arrived with a handwritten note from their mother that said simply, "Please come. Emma wants you there." Sarah doubted that was entirely true, but she went anyway because sometimes family obligations weighed more heavily than pride. She arrived at the venue alone on a cool Saturday evening in October, wearing the only formal dress she owned, a simple navy blue sheath she'd bought on clearance 4 years ago when she still had a different life. Her 6-year-old daughter Mia was spending the weekend with Sarah's former mother-in-law, one of the few people who had remained kind after the divorce. Sarah had debated bringing Mia to the wedding, but ultimately decided against it. The last thing she needed was for her daughter to witness whatever awkwardness might unfold between Sarah and her sister's wealthy new in-laws. The country club was exactly as elegant as Sarah had imagined, all white columns and crystal chandeliers and tables draped in ivory linens. She checked in at the guest table and felt the familiar weight of being evaluated by the well-dressed woman managing the seating chart. The woman's eyes moved from Sarah's discount dress to her worn shoes before handing over a table assignment with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Table 17, Sarah noticed, was positioned at the very back of the reception hall, partially obscured by a decorative column, the table for people who had to be invited but didn't quite belong. Sarah made her way through the cocktail hour, feeling increasingly out of place among Emma's new circle of friends and her fiancé's family connections. Everyone seemed to know each other, speaking in the comfortable shorthand of people who belonged to the same clubs and vacationed in the same places. Sarah accepted a glass of white wine from a passing server and found a quiet corner where she could observe without having to explain herself to anyone. She watched her sister move through the crowd, radiant in her wedding gown, laughing at something her future father-in-law was saying. Emma looked genuinely happy, and Sarah felt a complicated mixture of emotions that she couldn't quite name. 2 years ago, when Sarah's marriage had fallen apart and she'd found herself suddenly single with a young daughter and mounting debt, Emma had made her disapproval clear. She'd called Sarah's decision to leave her husband impulsive and selfish, had questioned whether Sarah had really tried hard enough to make things work. The fact that Sarah had left because staying had become emotionally unbearable didn't seem to matter. Emma believed in perseverance, in maintaining appearances, in not giving up on commitments. She believed these things right up until she didn't have to live them. The ceremony itself was beautiful in the way that expensive weddings always are. Sarah sat in the back row and watched her sister marry a man who seemed decent enough, though Sarah barely knew him. Afterward, guests filed into the reception hall, and Sarah made her way to table 17, where she discovered she'd been seated with a collection of distant relatives and family friends who seemed equally uncertain about why they were there. The conversation was polite but strained, the kind of small talk that fills space without creating connection. Sarah was halfway through her salad course when she became aware of someone standing beside her chair. She looked up to find a man in an impeccably tailored dark suit, probably in his early 40s, with grey just beginning to show at his temples. He had the kind of presence that suggested authority without needing to announce it, the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to when he spoke. He leaned down slightly and said in a voice low enough that only she could hear, "I apologize for the intrusion, but I need to ask you something unusual. Would you be willing to pretend to be my wife for the next few hours?" Sarah stared at him, certain she must have misheard. The man's expression remained serious, almost apologetic, as he continued, "I realize how that sounds. I can explain, but I'd prefer to do it somewhere less public. Would you mind stepping outside with me for just a moment? Every instinct Sarah had developed over the past 2 difficult years told her to refuse. She didn't know this man. His request was bizarre at best and potentially dangerous at worst. But there was something in his tone, a kind of desperate sincerity that seemed at odds with his polished exterior, that made her hesitate. She glanced around the table and realized no one was paying attention to their exchange. Everyone was focused on their meals or their own conversations. Sarah made a decision that surprised her, even as she made it. She stood and followed the stranger toward the terrace doors. Outside, the evening air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of the river that gave the club its name. The man walked a few steps away from the doors before turning to face her. Up close, Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes that suggested he was operating under considerable stress. He ran a hand through his dark hair and let out a breath that might have been relief or resignation. "My name is Daniel Ashford," he said, extending his hand. Sarah shook it automatically, noting the firm grip and the calluses that suggested he didn't spend all his time behind a desk. "I'm the groom's uncle, and I'm in an extremely awkward situation. My mother is inside that reception hall, and she's brought a woman she's decided I should marry. She's been orchestrating this introduction for months, and I've been putting it off because I'm not remotely interested. But my mother is relentless, and short of causing a scene at my nephew's wedding, I don't know how to make her stop." Sarah processed this information slowly. "So you want me to pretend to be your wife to avoid your mother's matchmaking?" Daniel nodded, looking both embarrassed and determined. "I know it's an absurd request. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate. My mother means well, but she doesn't understand boundaries. And this particular woman she's chosen is the daughter of her bridge partner. If I reject her outright at a family wedding, it will cause problems that will last for months. But if I'm already married, the situation resolves itself without anyone losing face." Sarah crossed her arms, studying him with increasing skepticism. "Why me? You don't know me. I don't know you. How is this supposed to work?" Daniel met her gaze directly. "Because you're sitting alone at table 17, which means you're probably not particularly close to either the bride or groom. Because you look like someone who would appreciate a way to make this evening more bearable. And because I noticed you watching the room earlier with the expression of someone who feels as out of place as I do at these events, despite the fact that half the people here are my relatives." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Sarah felt exposed in a way she hadn't expected, as if this stranger had seen past her careful composure to the loneliness underneath. "What exactly would pretending to be your wife entail?" she asked, her voice more cautious than she'd intended. Daniel's expression softened slightly. "Nothing inappropriate, I promise. We'd simply need to sit together. Perhaps dance once or twice if my mother is watching. We'd need to act comfortable with each other, the way people do when they've been together for a while. At some point, I'll introduce you to my mother as my wife, we'll make polite conversation, and then we can both get through the rest of this evening without further complications." Sarah looked back toward the reception hall, where through the windows she could see the other guests at her table making conversation that seemed to exclude the empty chair where she'd been sitting. She thought about the long evening ahead, the small humiliations of being seated at the overflow table, the careful avoidance of her sister, who had made it clear through seating arrangements that Sarah's presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. She thought about her daughter spending the weekend away, about the modest apartment they shared, about all the ways her life had contracted since the divorce. And she thought about the strange relief of being seen by this man who seemed to understand what it felt like to not quite belong in a room full of people who should have been family. "I have conditions," Sarah said finally. Daniel nodded immediately, as if he'd been expecting this. Name them. Sarah held up her hand and began counting on her fingers. First, nothing physical beyond what's absolutely necessary for appearances. Second, you tell me the truth about why you're really doing this, because avoiding your mother's matchmaking doesn't quite add up to recruiting a stranger as a fake wife. Third, at the end of the evening we part ways and never speak of this again. And fourth, if at any point I want to stop, we stop, no questions asked. Daniel considered her conditions carefully before responding. All of those are reasonable. As for your second point, you're right that there's more to it. The woman my mother wants me to meet isn't just her friend's daughter. She's someone I dated briefly years ago, and it ended badly. My mother never knew the details, and I'd prefer to keep it that way. Having her force a reunion at a family wedding feels like a particular kind of torture I'm not equipped to handle tonight. The honesty in his admission surprised Sarah. She'd expected evasion or charm, but instead he'd given her something real. She made her decision quickly before she could talk herself out of it. "All right," she said, "I'll help you. But you should know that I'm not very good at this sort of thing. I'm terrible at small talk. I don't know anything about your family, and there's a decent chance your mother will see right through this." Daniel's expression shifted into something that might have been relief mixed with gratitude. "That's fine. In my experience, the best lies are the ones that contain as much truth as possible. We'll keep it simple. How long have we been married?" Sarah thought for a moment. 3 years. Long enough that people won't expect us to be overly demonstrative, but recent enough that we're still figuring things out. "Do we have children?" Daniel asked, and Sarah felt her chest tighten slightly before answering. "I have a daughter. She's 6. You can decide whether you want to claim her as yours or whether you prefer to be a stepfather." Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. "What's your daughter's name?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She hadn't expected him to care about the details. "Mia," she said softly. "Her name is Mia." "Then I'm her stepfather," Daniel replied without hesitation. "That way we don't have to lie about timelines, and it's closer to whatever your real situation actually is." The consideration in his response made Sarah's carefully maintained walls crack, just slightly. She nodded and turned back toward the reception hall, Daniel falling into step beside her. They re-entered the reception hall together, and Sarah immediately felt the difference that Daniel's presence created. Heads turned as they walked past tables, not because anyone was particularly interested in Sarah, but because Daniel Ashford commanded a certain automatic attention. He guided her not back to table 17, but to a table near the front, where several well-dressed couples were already seated. Daniel pulled out a chair for Sarah and introduced her simply as his wife, offering no further explanation for why she hadn't been there earlier. The people at the table accepted this without question, the way people do when someone speaks with enough confidence that contradicting them seems unnecessary. Sarah found herself seated between Daniel and a woman who introduced herself as Claire, apparently the wife of Daniel's business partner. Claire was friendly in a way that felt genuine rather than performative, asking Sarah questions about herself that seemed motivated by actual interest rather than social obligation. Sarah kept her answers vague but truthful, mentioning her daughter, her work as a bookkeeper for a small medical practice, her life in the outer suburbs of Portland. She didn't mention the divorce or the financial struggles or the complicated relationship with her sister. Claire didn't press for details, instead sharing stories about her own children and the chaos of managing a household while her husband traveled frequently for work. Daniel participated in the conversation naturally, occasionally placing his hand on the back of Sarah's chair or leaning close to make a comment meant only for her. His touches were careful and brief, never crossing the boundaries she'd established, but convincing enough that anyone watching would believe they were comfortable with each other. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly, drawn into the rhythm of their performance. It was easier than she'd expected, perhaps because Daniel seemed to be someone who understood the value of restraint. About halfway through dinner, an elegant, older woman approached their table with purpose. She was clearly Daniel's mother, bearing the same dark hair now silvered with age and the same direct gaze that suggested she was accustomed to getting what she wanted. Behind her trailed a younger woman, probably in her late 30s, wearing an expensive dress and an expression of carefully maintained composure that Sarah recognized from her own mirror. "Daniel," his mother said warmly, leaning down to kiss his cheek. "I've been looking for you. I wanted to introduce you to Catherine Brennan. You remember Catherine, don't you? Margaret's daughter?" Daniel stood smoothly, and Sarah noticed the slight tension that entered his shoulders. "Mother," he replied, his voice pleasant but careful. "Of course I remember, Catherine. It's good to see you again." He turned slightly and extended his hand toward Sarah. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Sarah." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Daniel's mother stared at Sarah with an expression that cycled rapidly through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been disappointment before settling on polite interest. Catherine Brennan's face had gone carefully blank, revealing nothing of what she might be thinking. Sarah stood as well, extending her hand to Daniel's mother with more confidence than she felt. "Mrs. Ashford," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady, "it's lovely to finally meet you. Daniel has told me so much about his family." The lie came easier than Sarah expected, perhaps because she'd spent the past 2 years perfecting the art of appearing fine when she wasn't. Daniel's mother recovered quickly, taking Sarah's hand with a grip that suggested she was reassessing the situation. "I'm sorry. Did you say wife? Daniel, when exactly did this happen? You haven't mentioned anything about being married." Daniel's expression remained pleasant, but firm. "About 3 years ago. We've kept it fairly quiet. Sarah prefers privacy, and given my work situation, we thought it was better to maintain some separation between my personal and professional life." His mother's eyes narrowed slightly, and Sarah could see her calculating whether to challenge this story or accept it. 3 years is quite a long time to keep a marriage secret, Daniel. Your father and I would have liked to have been informed. "It wasn't a secret," Daniel replied calmly. "It was simply private. There's a difference." He placed his hand lightly on Sarah's back, a gesture of support that felt genuine despite its performative purpose. "Sarah has a daughter, Mia, and we wanted to make sure the family dynamics were stable before making broader announcements. I'm sure you can understand that." Catherine Brennan had been watching this exchange with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. When she finally spoke, her voice was controlled but carried an edge. "Congratulations on your marriage, Daniel. I hope you'll both be very happy." She turned to Daniel's mother. "Margaret, thank you for the introduction, but I think I should return to my table. Please give my regards to your husband." She walked away with her dignity intact, leaving Daniel's mother to process what had just occurred. Mrs. Ashford studied Sarah with increased intensity, as if trying to determine whether her son's supposed wife was worthy of the deception he was clearly maintaining. "Sarah," she said finally, her tone shifting to something more conversational. "What is it you do for work?" The question was a test, Sarah realized, an attempt to place her within the social hierarchy that people like Mrs. Ashford used to organize the world. Sarah met her gaze directly. "I'm a bookkeeper for a small medical practice in Beaverton. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady, and it allows me to have a flexible schedule for my daughter." Something in Mrs. Ashford's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing in Sarah's honesty a quality she hadn't expected. "And how did you and Daniel meet?" This question was more complicated, requiring quick thinking. Before Sarah could answer, Daniel interjected smoothly. "Through a mutual friend who thought we might have things in common." It turned out he was right. The vagueness of the explanation was intentional, Sarah realized, giving his mother nothing concrete to verify or challenge. Mrs. Ashford looked between them for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I see. Well, I suppose I should be grateful my son found someone who makes him happy, even if he chose not to share that happiness with his family in a timely manner." The reproach was clear, but delivered with enough grace that it didn't require a response. She excused herself, leaving Sarah and Daniel standing together near the table. Sarah waited until Mrs. Ashford was out of earshot before speaking quietly. "That was the woman you dated, Catherine?" Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. "5 years ago. It ended when I discovered she was more interested in my family's real estate holdings than in me personally. My mother never knew the details. She just knew we stopped seeing each other, and she's apparently been trying to engineer a reunion ever since." They sat back down, and Sarah found herself studying Daniel with increased curiosity. He'd revealed more about himself in that brief exchange than she'd expected, and it made her wonder what else lay beneath his polished exterior. The reception continued around them. Speeches were made, toasts were offered, and Sarah found herself actually enjoying portions of the evening despite its bizarre beginning. Daniel was easy company when he chose to be, asking her questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite conversation. He wanted to know about Mia, about Sarah's work, about how she'd ended up at her sister's wedding sitting alone at table 17. Sarah found herself answering more honestly than she'd intended. She told him about the divorce 2 years ago, about her ex-husband, who had been charming and attentive until the moment she'd gotten pregnant, at which point he'd revealed himself to be someone entirely different. She told him about the financial struggles that had followed, the difficulty of rebuilding a life while caring for a young child. She didn't tell him about the shame of asking her brother for money to pay rent, or the humiliation of having her sister suggest she should have tried harder to make her marriage work, but Daniel seemed to understand the parts she didn't say, responding with a kind of careful empathy that suggested he knew something about disappointment. When the dancing began, Daniel stood and offered Sarah his hand. "My mother is watching," he said quietly. "One dance should be sufficient to maintain the illusion." Sarah let him lead her to the dance floor, aware of the eyes following them. Daniel was a competent dancer, guiding her through a simple waltz with enough confidence that Sarah didn't have to think about the steps. This close to him, she could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive, and feel the solid warmth of his hand at her waist. "Thank you for doing this," Daniel said as they moved through the crowd of other dancers. "I know it's been strange, and I appreciate you going along with it." Sarah looked up at him, noting the genuine gratitude in his expression. "Why do I get the feeling this evening has been as difficult for you as it has been for me?" Daniel's mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because we're both here fulfilling obligations to families who don't quite understand us, and we're both wondering why we came at all." The observation was uncomfortably accurate, and Sarah found herself nodding. "My sister and I haven't spoken properly in 2 years. She thinks I gave up on my marriage too easily. She thinks I should have stayed and worked it out, no matter how unhappy I was. Tonight was supposed to be some kind of reconciliation, but I've been here for 3 hours and she hasn't said more than hello to me." Daniel's hand tightened slightly at her waist, a gesture of support. Some people only understand perseverance when it looks the way they expect it to. They can't see that sometimes leaving is the harder choice. The song ended, and they remained on the dance floor as another began. Sarah realized she wasn't ready to return to the table yet. wasn't ready to give up the strange comfort of being with someone who seemed to understand the particular loneliness of not quite belonging in places where you were supposed to feel at home. They danced through 2 more songs before Daniel finally guided her back to their table. The evening wound down gradually, guests beginning to drift toward the exits as the hour grew late. Daniel's mother approached one final time, her expression more thoughtful than it had been earlier. "Sarah," she said, addressing her directly, "I hope we'll have a chance to get to know each other better under less complicated circumstances. Perhaps you and Daniel and your daughter could join us for Sunday dinner sometime soon." It was both an invitation and a test, Sarah realized, Mrs. Ashford's way of determining whether this marriage was real or a convenient fiction. Before Sarah could fumble for a response, Daniel spoke up. "We'll see what we can arrange, Mother. Sarah's schedule with Mia is fairly full, but I'm sure we can find a time that works." His mother nodded, kissed his cheek, and departed, leaving Sarah feeling suddenly exhausted by the effort of maintaining their charade. As guests continued to leave, Sarah realized their performance was essentially over. Soon she would return to her real life, to her daughter and her small apartment and the careful budget that defined her days. The strange interlude with Daniel Ashford would become nothing more than an odd memory, a story she'd probably never tell anyone because it was too bizarre to be believed. Daniel walked her to her car, an old Honda Civic that looked decidedly modest next to the luxury vehicles filling the country club parking lot. Sarah felt a familiar flush of embarrassment as she unlocked the door, aware of how her car must appear to someone like Daniel. But when she glanced at him, his expression held no judgment, only a kind of thoughtful consideration that suggested he was working through something in his mind. "Sarah," he said as she opened her car door, "I'd like to give you something. Not as payment for tonight, but as an acknowledgement that you helped me avoid a situation I wasn't equipped to handle." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and held it out to her. Sarah stared at it without taking it, feeling her defenses rise. "I don't want your money, Daniel. That wasn't what this was about." "I know," he replied gently. "But I also know that single mothers working as bookkeepers in suburban medical practices don't usually have a lot of financial cushion. This is enough to cover a few months of expenses, whatever you need it for. Consider it a thank you from someone who can afford to say it meaningfully." Sarah wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her pride and her independence. But she also thought about the overdue electric bill sitting on her kitchen counter, about the field trip permission slip she'd had to decline because she couldn't afford the fee, about all the small compromises she made daily to keep her and Mia's heads above water. She took the envelope with trembling hands, not opening it, but holding it carefully as if it might disappear. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words inadequate for the relief flooding through her. Daniel nodded, stepping back to give her space. "Take care of yourself, Sarah, and take care of Mia. You're doing better than you think you are." Sarah drove home through dark suburban streets, the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside her. When she finally opened it, in her apartment, she found $5,000 in crisp hundreds and a business card with Daniel's name and a phone number written on the back in careful script. Below the number was a single line. "If you ever need anything, call me. No obligations, no expectations." She tucked the money away carefully, knowing it would cover the bills that had been keeping her awake at night, would buy Mia the winter coat she needed, would provide the breathing room Sarah hadn't had in months. But it was the card she kept looking at, wondering about the man who had asked her to pretend to be his wife for an evening and somehow managed to see past her carefully maintained composure to the struggling woman underneath. 3 weeks later, Sarah's phone rang with an unfamiliar number. When she answered, Daniel's voice came through the line, professional but warm. "Sarah, I hope I'm not overstepping, but I wanted to ask you something. My company has an opening for a senior financial analyst. The position would be a significant step up from what you're doing now, and it comes with full benefits, including childcare assistance. I thought of you immediately. Would you be interested in interviewing? Sarah sat down slowly, her heart racing. Daniel, I can't accept a job just because you feel obligated to help me. His response came quickly, tinged with something that sounded almost like frustration. This isn't about obligation, Sarah. I spent that evening watching you navigate a difficult social situation with grace and intelligence. I saw how you carried yourself with dignity despite circumstances that would have broken other people. Those are exactly the qualities I look for in people I want on my team. The job is real, the position is open, and you're qualified. What you choose to do with that information is entirely up to you. Sarah closed her eyes, thinking about Mia, about the future she wanted to build for her daughter, about the difference between accepting help and accepting opportunity. "Send me the details," she said finally. "I'll think about it." Daniel's relief was audible. "That's all I'm asking. Think about it." 6 months later, Sarah sat in her new office at Ashford Holdings, reviewing financial reports for one of the company's real estate acquisitions. Mia was in the building's excellent childcare centre, thriving in an environment that challenged and supported her. Sarah had proven herself capable in ways that had surprised even her, and Daniel had kept his professional distance, treating her as a valued colleague rather than the woman he'd once asked to pretend to be his wife. But sometimes, late in the day, when the office had emptied and Sarah was finishing up her work, Daniel would stop by her office to ask about Mia or share a story from his day. And in those moments, Sarah would remember that evening at her sister's wedding, when two lonely people had found unexpected connection in the middle of performing roles they didn't quite fit. She'd learned that kindness sometimes arrived in strange packages, that dignity could be maintained even while accepting help, and that the most transformative relationships often began with someone simply seeing you when you felt invisible. The evening at the country club had been an ending for the person Sarah had been, isolated and struggling, and convinced she had to manage everything alone. But it had also been a beginning, the first step toward building a life where she didn't just survive but flourished, where her daughter could grow up watching her mother be valued and respected, where Sarah herself could finally acknowledge that asking for help wasn't weakness, but wisdom. And whenever she doubted herself, she would remember Daniel's words on that October evening, spoken with a sincerity that had cut through all her defenses. "You're doing better than you think you are." Sometimes the most important moments in life arrive disguised as favors we do for strangers, as performances that reveal unexpected truths about who we are and who we're capable of becoming. Sarah had learned that transformation doesn't always announce itself with drama or grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with a simple question asked by someone who sees past the surface to the person underneath, someone willing to offer not rescue, but recognition, not charity, but opportunity. And sometimes that's enough to change everything.